Bienvenidos a todos, muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Vamos a iniciar. Esta charla va a ser en inglés, entonces voy a presentar a la persona en inglés. Dr. Craig Martin is Reader in Design Studies at University of Edinburgh, where he teaches on the Master's Design for Change program. As an academic with an interdisciplinary background in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, he is particularly interested in the ethical and social dimensions of design, especially the complex power dynamics that constitute design. These include both the benevolent aspects of design for meaningful social change, but equally the malevolent nature of design's role in society, which often remain unsaid. His research explores many of these aspects, including the forthcoming book, Bloomsbury Academic, Deviant Design, the ad hoc, the illicit, the controversial. His previous books include Shipping Container, also by Bloomsbury Academic in 2016, which explores the infrastructural politics of design. A key area of his current research is the relationship between design and the post-capitalism, including degrowth. Thank you, Craig, for being here today.
Well, thank you, Regina, for the invitation. It's wonderful to join you and everyone else today. I'd also like to thank Carmen, who is an ex-student on the Design for Change program from Edinburgh, who invited me as well. So it's great to see what the sort of various alumni from the Design for Change program at Edinburgh are actually doing now. So it's wonderful to be with you all. I've also heard just about the range of other events you've had as part of the series. The talks sound incredible. So I think, you know, as students and academics, you should feel very proud that you're able to take part in all these amazing events. So it's really nice to be able to join you and to talk about some of the current research. As Regina said, what I'd like to talk today about is really the kind of broader idea of the social complexities that surround design. So I'm not going to talk too much about the kind of practical aspects of sustainability, for example, and it's great to hear that you've been doing some experimental workshops exploring that. But in today's talk, I just wanted to really explore some of the ways in which I've been thinking about social complexity, and I hope to a certain degree that some of the things I'll talk about today might help you to think about ideas of sustainability, design futuring, and how, as a new generation of designers, you can engage with meaningful social and environmental change. But I hope more than anything what I'm going to talk today is talk about the need to understand the complexity of designing for change in particular. So just by way of an introduction, and thank you to Regina for that lovely introduction as well, what I'd like to just start by doing is talking about some of the background to some of the issues that I'm interested in through design. And in particular, one of the key factors I've always been interested in is what I've called the social forces of mundane design. So in particular, I've always been interested in what I've called design from below the radar. So what I mean is that design, thinking about design in ways that we haven't traditionally thought of. So in the past, I've published journal articles and papers on things like mundane packaging design. So on the left-hand slide here, you should hopefully be able to see the type of kind of packaging inserts that when you receive consumer goods that typically you might in the past have thrown away, or hopefully now I'm sure that you would recycle them. But what I've argued is that these types of design, and they are design, are actually vitally important to how we think about material goods, material artifacts. Probably the place where I've talked about this most of all was in my book on the right hand side here called Shipping Container from 2016. And really what that book looked at was really the geopolitical power of design. So the design of this very simple box, in many ways, what I argue in the book has created the capitalist society that we live in today. But also what I've talked about that is the significant power of this as a design object in making the kind of geopolitical world that we live in. So one of the things in particular is what I mean by below the radar is we take these types of design for granted. And for me, this is really the hidden power of design is, when perhaps when you say to friends or family that you're a designer, they might have particular associations of certain designer goods, particularly technological artifacts. But for me, one of the kind of hidden powers of design lies with these types of objects, things that we take for granted. And in particular, in the shipping container book, there was one chapter where I talked about drug smuggling. The reason being is that actually shipping containers are widely used to smuggle illegal goods, illegal narcotics, primarily because of their taken for granted quality. So the fact that we see them all around us and they're ignored. But for me, that is one of the really important things about design, is actually appreciating that the ignored design that we take for granted is perhaps some of the most powerful design that we see. Some of these ideas I am or have and still am exploring in my latest book. So this, as Regina mentioned, is my latest book. It's called Deviant Design: The Ad Hoc, the Illicit, the Controversial. And in here, so this is forthcoming in a few months' time. In here, I develop some of the arguments that I've just mentioned. So what I particularly do in the book is argue that the significance of design has been traditionally thought of in terms of designing for the social good. That is, making society better, making for better or more sustainable futures. And that is incredibly important, obviously. And actually, as Carmen will hopefully remember and will know, that's one of the things we talk about on the Design for Change program at Edinburgh, is actually designing for social, technological, and environmental change. But one of the things that's always interested me is that actually part of the power of design resides in some of the negative consequences that it's had. And what I do in the book is try to kind of explore some of these negative aspects of design. But in the final chapter of the book, I have a much more positive outcome to say that if we can understand the negative power of design, then as designers like yourself, actually we can make design better. So actually through these negative, malevolent aspects of design, that actually we can understand its power and use that power for social good ultimately. But what I do in the book, and I'm going to talk just a bit about the book for a few slides, and then I'll move on to some of the more kind of core aspects of today's talk. One of the things I talk about in the book is that design, and unfortunately I think designers have been complicit in creating the unsustainable world that we live in, or I'm sure many of you know the work of Tony Fry when he talks about defuturing. So Tony Fry says this as well, is that designers have been complicit in creating unsustainable futures. One example of that that I talk about in the book is really design's complicity with capitalism. So not give you a whole history of design by any means, but the origins of industrial design are very much rooted within capitalism. So actually one of the key things, and Regina mentioned it in some of my sort of forthcoming research, is around a sort of design's potential within a post-capitalist politics, and particularly one of my more recent interests is in degrowth. So the idea of a degrowth society and what design's place within that might be. But in this book, in Deviant Design, I talk about design's complicity within the creation of overconsumption, the creation of waste, as we can see here in terms of ocean plastics. Design, I also think, has been complicit in the creation of gender and racial inequalities. So the book on the left here, Invisible Woman, if you don't know, it's a very interesting book which talks about data bias, but I think it does something more broadly than that, which is actually to say that the world has been designed for men. So actually that's created very particular types of patriarchal structures. It's developed particular types of products. It's developed particular types of services and systems. And likewise, the Design of Race, the book here by Peter Claver Fine on the right-hand side, it's actually talked about the sort of how visual culture has shaped America's very, very poor responses, obviously, to racial inequalities. So in some ways, what I talk about in the introduction to the book is this way in which design has been guilty, in inverted commas, of creating these very sort of unequal systems and services in the world around us. I also sort of touch in the book, and I'll come back a bit to this later on, but I also talk about in the book that in many ways, design and designers have often been involved in solving problems. And again, excuse me, Carmen will probably remember this from her time in Edinburgh. One of the things that I've always been interested in is the notion of wicked problems. So this idea of highly complex social problems that designers, architects, social thinkers, etc. have been dealing with. And in many ways, what design, up until fairly recently, has been doing is dealing with almost quite simple problem-solving activities, which often could be technical. Now, the reason I've got this image up here is that there was a wonderful book and an exhibition exhibition that was highly influential on my thinking for my new book. And the book, if you can get hold of it, is called Design and Violence. I believe there's still some images online about the exhibition. One of the examples in the exhibition was the design of these plastic handcuffs. Now, one of the key things of this, that these are incredibly efficient at holding hands together. And for me, this raises questions about the ethics of problem solving. So as designers, we're often called upon to solve a problem. So that could be sort of through technical means, for example. Now, one of the things I talk about in the book is actually what is the ethics of problem solving? So as designers, should we actually be questioning what we're being asked to do? And that's something that I think is very important in terms of how we think about social good in relation to design, is actually thinking about the negative consequences of design in order to design for a better future. So ultimately, the aim of the book is to address alternative forms of design thinking. So what I'm talking about here is not design thinking in that traditional kind of business sense. If we think about how organizations like IDEO have talked about design thinking over the last 15 or 20 years, I'm thinking about different forms of design thinking. So how people think about solving problems or encountering problems through design, but out with of ways in which we've traditionally thought about that. So really what I'm saying is that thinking about how we can address particular forms of design thinking through alternative means that really demonstrate the power of design, but ultimately speak to the way in which, or the complexities that determine design. And so that's what I'm going to talk about primarily today, is this notion of the social complexities that underpin how we understand design. So just a couple of key points before I move on. Interestingly, when I was developing the proposal for the book, I had a very interesting discussion with the publishers, and at first they were a bit reluctant for me to use the word deviant design, primarily because it has particular connotations or particular ways in which we understand this notion of deviancy. But for me, in the book, I use the word deviant in two ways. So firstly, as you can see in the top portion of the slide here, I talk about forms of design that don't fit within the normative coding of how design is understood or how it's promoted. And what I mean by that is I'm talking about forms of design that deviate, i.e. they move away from how we've traditionally understood design. And that relates to some of the previous work that I've done around, mundane packaging design or even the shipping container. These perhaps aren't the types of design that we think about when someone says, I am a designer. So it's about moving away from these traditional conceptions. The second idea of deviation that I talk about is primarily sociological. So this is really forms of alternative design practice that really defy or go against this idea of the social good. So in particular, forms of design that we might think of as illegal or illicit. By that, I'm using the sociological or criminological notion of deviance, i.e. something that is abnormal. So what I've done in the book, and that's hence the title of today's talk, is I've really focused on what in English we would call a heuristic device, so a device that allows us to think about something. And for that end, I've used a term in the book, asocial design. So what I mean by this is a diffuse range of design practices that are inherently social, i.e. they're engaged with social questions or social problems or social issues, but really they deviate from how the social, i.e. society, has been typically constructed as benevolent, i.e. that we should strive to make society better. So what I do in the book, alongside these more kind of theoretical explorations, I have a series of case studies. So these case studies are a way for me to explore some of these broader ideas of the type of design that I'm interested in. So again, design that falls below that radar that I mentioned. One example is this, which is talking about the ad hocist misuse of things. So I'm interested in many ways in how consumers, that is people consuming material goods, misuse them. So use them in ways that are out with the intentions of designers themselves. So the image you see here was from a research project that I carried out a few years ago, where we looked at how migrants in refugee camps in Burkina Faso in West Africa had repurposed the energy goods. So these were things like cooking stoves that the UNHCR had submitted or donated to these migrant camps, but they didn't work very well. So what had happened is the migrant community had repurposed the materials. So what you see here is a shelter that one of the migrants had repurposed. So the aluminium sheeting you can see here was actually part of a solar cook stove that the migrants had actually taken apart and used to create this shelter. So I'm interested in many ways in which people misuse things on purpose. And so at the beginning of the book, or at the beginning of the first case study, I talk about misuse as a form of low-level deviancy. In the book, I'm also interested in different forms of creativity, so very much related to that idea of misusing things. I explore a range of examples, actually internationally as well, of how people, non-designers in particular, actually solve problems. So this was just a case from where I live in Scotland. So this was an example where, as you can hopefully see here, there was a boat. And here in Scotland, it can often get very windy. So often what people do is hold down the boats by weighting them down. But rather than buying something, what we see here is how someone has repurposed this bit of old concrete to weight it down. So again, there's something here about sort of repurposing materials as a form of what I call in the book diffuse design thinking. So what I'm doing here is looking at how other people other than designers are thinking about creative problem solving. So it's a form of designly thinking, but not in the typical way that we would think about it. One of the other case studies I have in the book is about counterfeit design. So as I said earlier, design is very much rooted to the origins of capitalism, and particular to consumer culture. So one chapter in the book really looks at the whole culture around counterfeit design. And in particular, I argue that we shouldn't be surprised that the desire for consumer goods has led to the desire for counterfeit consumer goods that are incredibly cheap. So what I do is really explore this whole notion of counterfeit design as a way that we can think about the kind of negative consequences of design. And in particular, overconsumption to me is related to this desire for more and more stuff. So again, I think the creation of consumer culture and the link to design shows that design, unfortunately, does have negative consequences. And then the final case study, and one I'll talk about a little bit later on today, is around these types of objects. So when we look at this, we think about, you probably don't know exactly what it is, but it's a box to transport pets. So if you think about a cat or a dog being delivered or transported, across international borders, these are the types of boxes that animals are often transported in. Now, the important thing for me is not so much that this is a box, but this is a box that's been repurposed and adapted for drug smuggling. So one of the core chapters in the book looks at this notion of the material cultures of drug smuggling. The reason being is, and I'll talk about this in more depth quite soon, is the material knowledge that these smugglers bring to these types of objects, for me, is a form of design thinking in its own right, i.e. how can they send narcotics across international borders without raising the awareness of security services. So they're often using these types of mundane, everyday types of pet transportation boxes, for example. Okay, so these are just some of the case studies that I talk about in the book. Already you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with this idea of sustainability? So again, some of the other workshops you've had so far sound absolutely fantastic, sort of learning about new material potentials. You're probably thinking, what does this really have to do with sustainable futures? Your practice as a designer, for example, or it might be how through your work you're trying to, improve social conditions for communities, or it might be that you want to play a role in using design to intervene in the climate crisis, for example, or you want to use design or challenge design itself through decolonizing its historical imperatives. All of these points are incredibly important. What I argue in the book, and what I hope comes across today, is that whilst we have these range of diffuse design practices that are inherently social, but actually illegal if we think particularly about drug smuggling, what I believe, and I hope comes across in the book and across in the talk today, is that actually if we can learn about the power of design thinking, the power, the illicit power that has created the type of design that I'm talking about in the book, if we can understand that power of such practices, we can actually use them to create sustainable futures. So what I'm really trying to do in the book is to say that actually if we can understand the negative power of design, we can hopefully transform that into much more positive, sustainable futures. So just carrying on now with this notion of asocial design, what I want to try and do is to give you a sense of how I've built up this idea of asocial design in particular. So what I'm going to talk about is really the move from social to asocial design. So I'm not talking about more recent conceptions of social design in relation to healthcare design or design for aging. For me, what's really important is to understand what we mean by the social. So in particular, as designers, you are acting in social circumstances, you're acting within societal frameworks. And in particular, what I want to do is to try and understand this notion of the complexities of how you as designers engage with these social issues. So this is where I use this notion of the move from social design to asocial design. I'm sure for many of you, one of the important sort of books or important examples that is of interest to you is the work of Victor Papanek. He's been a really important designer and design thinker for me for a long time, since I first encountered his work, I think probably in the early 1990s when I was a student. In his book Design for the Real World, he for me has some very important discussions of how we think about the role of design and the role of designers in particular. So this is a diagram for me that's been very important how we understand Papanek's work. So this diagram is essentially a distillation, so a sort of summary of how he sees traditionally the role of the designer. So what he says is the world, as you see it here, is the triangle. So obviously a very sort of simplified version of the world. But he said that traditionally the designer's place, the designer's share of the world has been this tiny bit of triangle at the top, so that tiny black triangle at the top. What he says was the real problems, though, that designers should be thinking about are actually the rest of that triangle, so the rest of the world. So he says in the past there's been this separation between what the designer's been asked to do and actually the real social environmental problems that surround us. Remember, this is 1973, so I think the way in which we think about design today, particularly social design, is much more engaged with that sort of real problem. But back in 1973, Papanek was one of the really only people to kind of really understand that designers should be acting and addressing all these other real problems rather than just maybe a technical solution that we might think of as traditionally the domain of design. So this has been an important sort of way for me to think about the problems that designers are dealing with. But I do have an issue, and I think it's partly to do with the fact that Papanek was talking about this in 1973 originally. The problem I have is that in many ways, I think that Papanek is being a bit reductive. I think he's being a bit too simplistic in terms of how he thinks about these real world problems. So in many ways, I think what he was doing was making the case for a type of world or a type of social world that was essentially quite homogenous, that was quite sort of unified in many ways. So what I've been interested in trying to deal with this notion of the problems that designers encounter in the social world is actually thinking about what do we mean by this problem, this real problem? What are the real problems that designers are engaging with? And one of the ways in which I've been thinking about this is through the work of the philosopher and political theorist Hannah Arendt, and particularly her book, which was originally published in 1958, called The Human Condition. So one of the things that Arendt was talking about in this book was how the idea of society has been constructed. So what she does in the book is really critique some of the classic conceptions of how the social has been conceived. So what she argues is that traditionally society and how we think of the social has been conceived, as she calls it, as a sort of form of oneness. That is, there is one type of society, and that is there are particular codes and behaviours that become normalised. For example, when we go to school, when we're brought up as younger people, is that there are these particular behavioural codes that we're taught, and we have to agree to those codes. But as Arendt Arendt says here, if people don't keep to those codes, they're considered to be asocial or abnormal. And this is where I've sort of used this notion that she's talking about here of a type of asocial design. So what I mean by that is a type of design practice that breaks those behavioral codes that we're taught in terms of how we think about society. So this has been very important in terms of how we think about different types of design that don't fit those traditional molds of being for the social good. And so, for example, if we go back to those points about overconsumption, what I argue is that actually, in many ways, if we are designing more and more material goods that we don't need, is actually all form of design asocial? That is just a question, but I think it's something as a provocation that I'm interested in, is actually if design is creating these unsustainable futures by making too many goods that we actually don't require, is it actually being asocial? So I use this notion of asociality as a way to think about the complexity of dealing with society. So whilst Arendt's work has been very helpful for me to sort of think about critiquing this notion of this one type of society. Later work that falls under the banner of social complexity theory has been, I think, even better to allow us to think about the complexity of how society is structured. And in particular, the work of the science and technology scholar Bruno Latour has been very helpful for me and other people thinking about this idea of social complexity. If you're not familiar with Latour's work, his book, which is on the screen here, Reassembling the Social, is, I think, a very good introduction to many of these ideas. The subtitle of this is An Introduction to Actor Network Theory, which is an important facet of the study of social complexity. I'm going to just use a few bullet points to really kind of try and highlight some of the key points. What Latour talks about, literally on page 1 of the book, is that society, or as I call it, the social, is not a stabilized state of affairs, i.e., sometimes when people traditionally talked about society, and this is what Arendt was critiquing as well, was that society was almost this stable thing that we just took for granted, that we're born into a society that is stable, that's homogenous, that's always been there. Now, one of the things that Latour says is that there's been this presumption in the past that the social world around us is just simply a background that surrounds us. So we just get on with our lives, and the social is there, in the background. He distrusts this, as I do as well. In particular, what he says is rather than this sort of stable background that we just take for granted, is he argues that society, the social, is formed of these emergent relations between other human beings, ourselves and others, but also between humans and non-human life, so between objects and other non-human animals, for example. The key for me more than anything is this idea of emergent relations. So there isn't this stable kind of homogeneous background that we just act upon, rather that the world is developed through these relations between us and other non-human life. So this notion of emergent relations is absolutely central to this idea of social complexity. Related to that, and this is again very important, is that these relations that we have between one another and other non-human life is they're inherently unstable. That is, we can't predetermine what's going to happen. And the key to this is that this leads to unexpected things happening. So in many ways, this means that we can't control society, that these emergent relations between others, ourselves and others, are unstable. And through that instability rather, we have to think about how these relations are structured. And for me, this is a real challenge for designers. So rather than just these simple kind of problem solving activities as designers, we're engaging with these types of very unstable relations between things. So this is where I think design and designers have a very sort of tough challenge. So this is where I think, sort of, whilst I strongly believe in sustainable futures, for example, we need to think about what those types of sustainable futures are in relation to these types of instabilities. The final point that I take from Papanek's work is that there's not just simply a binary separation between this notion of the normal and the abnormal, or the good and the bad. So as Arendt was talking about as well, if we don't accept those behavioral codes, we're seen as being abnormal or asocial. But for me and people like Latour, we question sort of where these behavioral codes come from, i.e. who has created these codes in the first place. So it's not just this simple binary separation. We need to think about actually what do we mean by good design as opposed to bad design. So they're not just simply separated. So just to return back to Papanek's diagram, one of the things that I've been interested in is how we can think about social complexity to think about the role of design in the world around us. So whilst I'm very kind of positive about what Papanek has been doing here, ultimately the questions I ask is Papanek's social world too reductive? In that way, is it too homogenous? Is it pictured as too stable? So in many ways, I think what Papanek needed to do, and maybe he wasn't able to do it in 1973, but was to really investigate what we mean by society, what those real societal problems are. And it also leads me to the second question here, and here I'm paraphrasing the work of Arturo Escobar, particularly his book Designs for the Pluriverse. So in there he talks about this notion of pluriversality. So the question I have is really, how can many worlds fit within this one social world? So rather than just thinking there is a society out there, how as designers can we think about multiple social worlds? So different types of social worlds that can encompass lots of other aspects. And in that way, the question I have that leads out to that story is lots of questions more than answers, is how can you as designers deal with a social realm, so to deal with a society that is messy, i.e. it's not structured, it's disordered, it's confused, it's confusing. Actually just thinking about the talk today over obviously what's happened, very sadly in Ukraine, the disorderly nature of geopolitics means that, what do we do in the face of these types of disorderly behaviors? So this is highly complex, highly confusing, isn't it? But I also argue sort of that the social realm is made up of messiness, disorderliness, but also the illicit and the illegal as well. So what I'm trying to argue here is what I think Papanek should have been doing was to talk about the messiness of those real world problems. They're not just simply real world problems that can be easily solved. We need to think about their messiness in their totality. So this is where I have been starting to think about this relationship between traditional forms of social design, but this move from social design to this categorization of it as asocial design. I wanted to give you an example rather than just being too overly theoretical about this. There is, for example, within social design, there is a body of work, particularly here in the UK at University of the Arts London. There's a research centre which is called Design Against Crime. Which is a very interesting research centre, and the people who run it are very interesting in relation to the broader ideas of social complexity. But one of an example that relates to this notion of design against crime is this gripper clip, which you might be familiar either with this particular artifact, this particular design, or others similar to it. But I'm sure you'll know these if you're in a bar or cafe. Rather than putting your bag down on the floor or on the back of a chair, these clips have been developed where you can put the strap, hook it into this clip, and so it means that if someone is trying to steal bags, it's much harder for them to pull them away. So there is something I think very interesting and positive about this in terms of trying to deal with social issues such as this. But for me, one of the problems with this is, are such approaches overly simplistic? I.e. they're setting out to solve a problem, that is bags being stolen, but at the same time, shouldn't we as designers and design thinkers and practitioners be thinking about the bigger issues? So for example, why are people stealing bags? Is it to do with poverty? Is it to do with the fact that the welfare state, maybe in some countries, doesn't exist, or if it does exist in certain countries, isn't positive enough in terms of providing people with enough money, enough security that they wouldn't need to go out and steal? So what I'm saying here is, as designers, do we need to think in much bigger terms about the social? So rather than just simply solving the problem of theft, is actually thinking, why are people thieving? Do we need to redesign welfare systems in order to make design or make people not steal in this way? So this leads me to my second point here. Is it too simplistic that crime can actually be designed out? So don't we need to look at the foundations of criminality itself as designers? So as designers working with criminologists to understand why people thieve. So for me, this is where this question of asocial design hopefully in some way illustrates the need to think about society in much more complex terms. So what I'm talking about here is really a definition of asocial design as a range of design practices that embrace complexity. So that is forms of design practice that are inherently social, but deviate from how the social and design, importantly, hence it being read here, has been typically constructed as oneness. Rather, we need to encompass things that maybe fall out with of those types of oneness aspects. So those forms of design we might think as abnormal, or even forms of design we might think of as illicit or even illegal. So this leads me then just a couple of slides, and then I'll talk briefly about one of the case studies before I'll finish in the next 10 minutes or so. So this leads me to a question about design's hidden agendas. So I'm folding back here, I'm sort of flipping back slightly to some of the earlier slides that I talked about in terms of the negative consequences of design. And in particular, this work has intrigued me for a long time. This is a film, a short documentary, and a magazine article, which was developed in 1960, the film in particular in 1960, by the designer George Nelson. So some of you may be familiar with George Nelson's name. He's probably more widely known now for his furniture designs from the 1950s and 1960s, which have fallen into the sort of that moniker of mid-century design, mid-century modern design and architecture, which is very much the sort of lifestyle choices. And whilst Nelson was responsible for those types of designs, he also produced this really interesting film and article. And the title itself, I remember reading this a number of years ago and being really provoked by this. And it stopped me in my tracks when I first read the reference to it. So the film is called How to Kill People, A Problem of Design. So again, if you think about that, it's incredibly provocative. So again, if you think about why you wanted to go into design in the first place, as a youngster at school or wherever, or college, and then beginning to think about, I want to become a designer, it probably wasn't to do with how to kill people is why you went into design. But this is something that Nelson talks about in the film and the article. Unfortunately, I did used to have a clip of the film, but unfortunately it's no longer working, and it's no longer available on YouTube or other platforms. But if you can get hold of it somehow, it is really worth watching. So the premise of the film is that actually the origins of design relate to the design of weapons. So basically he talks about in sort of, if we think about kind of in prehistory, he says that if we think about people fighting one another, if we think about two people and fighting for food or whatever, he says that traditionally one might think about throwing a rock. So if you were trying to harm your opponent, you might think about trying to fight that opponent for food by throwing a rock at them. So what Nelson says is that the rock, whilst it can be very powerful as a weapon, has a limitation in that it's quite easy to miss. So if you're standing 20 meters from someone and trying to throw a rock, they can easily move, or you can just it's too heavy to throw. So he says what actually becomes a problem of design is to make the rock more efficient. And so this is where the image that I got here is, you see him holding a club. So essentially what he's saying is that the origins of design relate to how this tool, this weapon, was designed. So he says to make the rock more efficient, what designers are essentially have done is to add a shaft, add that wooden handle to the rock. So it means that actually there's enough distance between the person holding the club and trying to hit the other person, but there's also enough of distance so they're not sort of close together, and they can touch one another. So what essentially is happening is that he's saying that the designer here is making the rock much more efficient. So the important thing about this film and the article that relates to it is that the origins of design relate to the efficiency of killing. So again, I know that seems very provocative and probably something that none of you thought about in relation to you entering design, but this is what Nelson and others, myself included, are saying that actually are the roots of design, is actually the design of these types of tools as weapons. So there's this negative, really, really powerful negative history of design. So some of these aspects have been covered more recently as well. The third Istanbul Design Biennale in 2016 again explored many of these ideas, and this is just a quote from the catalogue, is that design routinely constructs radical inequalities. So again, it goes back to that book I was mentioning earlier, Invisible Women, that actually the design of services, of systems, of products has created radical inequalities. And again, the next sentence for me, or next part of that is very important. Design is even the design of neglect. So again, if we think about possibly how cities are designed, how urban planning is created, often is to do with the design of neglect of certain communities. Another example is around planned obsolescence as well. And it was great to hear from Regina earlier that you were having some workshops on different types of plastics, so in terms of sort of bioplastics and things like that. But actually, one of the things that again we need to think about, the negative consequences of design, is actually planned obsolescence. So if we go back to 1950s America, is the design of automobiles then were designed as fashion items. So actually, every few years they changed the design of cars to make them more consumable and more desirous. So this has led to this notion of planned obsolescence, which still pervades our consumer culture today. If we think about technological products that actually the operating systems become redundant after a few years, we throw them away or recycle them. But we don't need to do that, i.e. we can have much more of a circular system of consumption. But the origins of design in many ways come from building in the obsolescence of products. And then finally, just to return to the previous example, is that actually the origins of design through someone like Nelson's work, I think, relate directly to what we see here in terms of the examples from the Design and Violence exhibition and book, is that actually the efficiency of these plastic handcuffs doesn't really take into account, how they're used, why they're used. So there's an inherent question of the ethics of this in particular. Okay, so based on some of these points about asocial design and then the hidden agendas of design, I'm going to move on now briefly, because I'm aware that I'm running slightly over time, to talk about one of these case studies that I mentioned earlier. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the material culture of drug smuggling. And in particular, what I want to focus here is on this idea of the confluences between traditional forms of licit or legal design and, in this chapter in the book, what I call illicit design. And so what I'm talking about here is the relationships between licit and legal forms of design practice, thinking and knowledge, and how these have been applied in illicit contexts, so drug smuggling in particular. I'm going to run quite quickly through this, partly to do with time, but I'd also like to just bring the session to a conclusion to offer some time for some questions and debate. So just briefly, in the chapter of the book, I talk about different methods of trafficking drugs. So one of which is the body, one of which is specially designed, again, the word design here is very important, and fabricated vehicles, as well as the adaptation or the adaption of vehicles or objects that are already part of legal transportation networks. So the first method is really to do with the use of the body. So perhaps the most infamous example is when drugs mules are forced to swallow drugs in order to smuggle them across international borders. Another example that very much relates to the body is the design of what are called heroin vests. So this was an example that was intercepted by the National Crime Agency here in the UK in 2014. And this was a vest that was worn by someone, a smuggler, trying to smuggle drugs through Heathrow Airport in London. And this was a vest, if you like, that was designed with these pockets where the heroin was secreted. What interests me about these types of methods is an understanding of the materiality of these artifacts, the potential of these to fit close to the body, but also, again, the politics of disguise. So these vests are worn close to the skin, next to the body, and then thin enough that they don't arouse suspicion. The second method that I cover in the book is specially commissioned and designed vehicles. Probably the most, again, infamous example is the narco sub. So these are submarines that are specially developed to smuggle narcotics, invariably cocaine, across the Caribbean Ocean. This was one that was seized in Colombia in 1995. So of interest to me is this notion of the design of these vehicles, the engineering of these vehicles. Another example, which is actually these photos are from the book, is another case in Costa Rica from 2015, which was a drug pouch. So this was a pouch that was designed and then made and attached to these pigeons that were then, the pouches were then filled with marijuana. The reason being is that they were used to smuggle the marijuana into a prison. So obviously the birds were able to fly over the fences and then to land in the prison grounds for the prisoners to then take the marijuana out of it as well. But there's something important for me here as about the kind of problem-solving attitude we have here. So designing something that attaches to the pigeon, but also something that can circumvent the security practices of things like the scanners to stop these types of narcotics being smuggled into the prisons themselves. The third method, and again another historical example here, is the concealment of narcotics in illicit shipments of goods. So this is an example of something captured in 1962 in Hong Kong. So this was a child's doll. But as you can see on the left here, in the body, a cavity was cut out where heroin was smuggled. Going back to one of the first examples I mentioned, was the example of the pet transportation box. So the box you can see here, I showed the one on the left image earlier, but on the right here we can see where the gloved hand is showing where a compartment, a false compartment was created by the smugglers, and then heroin secreted under this, in this false floor. So when ostensibly when we see this, it just looks like a normal average pet transportation box. But there's a sort of form of design thinking here as the materiality of the artifact, but also the potential of this artifact as something that is embedded within the pet transportation business. The second point I just wanted to make with this, and I explore it in the book as well, there's another form of design thinking here, I argue, which is actually the design of the pet transportation business itself. So it's not just the box has been amended, it's that the pet transportation business has been created as a front, i.e. it's a fake company that's been created in order to smuggle heroin. So there's two forms of design here, I argue, the kind of material knowledge that smugglers develop, but also the systemic knowledge of creating this fake transportation business. And then just a final example before I sort of try and sum up some of these points, is one of the key phrases I use in the book is this notion of the design of disguise. So a lot of what I think these smugglers are doing is designing disguise. So disguising things in a particular way that they look normal. So again, to go back to that phrase that Arendt talks about between normal and abnormal, these things look like normal things we would expect to see in a pet transportation company, or in this case, these are, excuse me, some wooden pallets. So these are shipping pallets. If you were to order bags of sand or something like that, they would be delivered to your home on these wooden shipping pallets. Now, these pallets were used to transport goods between Colombia and Spain in 2015. But key to this, as you can see in the title, is that these wooden pallets weren't made out of wood. They were made out of solid compressed cocaine. So these were 1.4 tons of compressed cocaine were disguised to look like these wooden pallets. To the extent, as you can see here, they were sprayed black. I don't have a close-up shot, unfortunately, to hand, but they had real screws, so they looked completely legitimate. They were kind of had splinters in them to make it look like real wood. So this is, for me, more than anything about the design of these things, disguising them to look like legitimate artifacts that are just normal and taken for granted. Okay, So again, a bit like the previous question, you're probably thinking, what does any of this have to do with me as a designer today? So ultimately, what I'm saying is that the type of knowledge, the type of innovations that I think this type of illicit design embodies, I think we can learn a lot from it. So first of all, I haven't talked about this at length, I talk about it a bit in the book, is the war on drugs. So again, the desire for narcotics is often accompanied by the war on drugs. But the war on drugs isn't just this simple binary thing that drugs are bad, because actually there's a lot of complicity between different nation states in the production of drugs themselves. So actually the war on drugs is a highly complex social condition that isn't just simply good or bad. I think there's something interesting about the distribution of illegal drugs as a problem-solving activity, i.e. the transportation of something from A to B. So in many ways, when we think about design as a problem-solving activity, even though I have issues with this, is that there's something akin to this in terms of how we're trying to solve a particular material issue or a particular logistical or systemic issue. And then thirdly, and I think this is probably the most important for us as designers, is the sophistication that smugglers exhibit here. So there's a technical sophistication. I think when we see those narco subs from the mid-1990s through until just recently, there was one captured. It's a highly technical or highly sophisticated technical knowledge that pervades many of these techniques. But there's also material knowledge and understanding. So the PET transportation box is understanding the materiality of that. So the potential of a small cavity to then insert the heroin in. Likewise with the heroin vest as well. There's a deep material understanding here. The fourth point is this notion of systems thinking. And this is something that I think, particularly for your generation of designers is incredibly important. It's not just about singularized objects, excuse me. It's about understanding the broader systems within which design operates. So it's, in this case with the smugglers, there's an understanding of the ubiquity, so the sheer abundance of commodities, so the sheer abundance of things like wooden pallets being shipped across the globe, and how they're distributed. So it's understanding the systems that are in place to transport commodities and how those systems themselves can be co-opted and used for smuggling. Okay, about 5 minutes over, so I'm just going to quickly wrap up. So just by way of conclusion, just to say there are a number of points I haven't had time to raise today. More than anything, I think, is the moral dimension of smuggling, obviously. So whilst I think there is a level of hypocrisy in terms of the war on drugs, I do think there are some moral questions about, obviously, the significant social effects of the consumption of drugs. I'm very aware of that. So there are ethical dimensions, both to what we do as designers, but also, obviously, the moral dimensions of studying these types of examples. What I would say, though, is what does this mean for you as designers, but also for design more generally? So again, in the book itself, when I talk about deviant design, I'm not saying that design is by any means deviant, but I think what we need to do is understand the kind of origins of the negative impact of design and what we can learn from that. So firstly, I hope you don't sort of leave the talk today and go and talk to your academics, or go home and talk to your families or friends and say that you were asked to create deviant design. I'm not asking you to do this by any means, to design something that's illegal. Rather, what I hope to have shown today, and what I explore in the book in much greater detail, is that we need to, how we can use this to understand the social complexity of design, and hopefully through that enable us to recognize the ethical challenges of designing. And I've underscored that for hopefully obvious reasons, because in more ways than one, I think the book and the talk today has been about ethics. I haven't used the word much, but I wanted to leave it here because there are so many ethical challenges of being a designer today. So put yourself in the position of the designer who's asked to develop those new types of handcuffs. What would be your ethical or moral responsibility if you were asked to do this? So that is, for me, the social complexity of design today, are the ethical implications of what these things can do. I do hope that what I've done is not to alarm you, but also to realistically say that design hasn't always been socially beneficial. Design has created many of the problems that surround us today. And as I say, as its hidden origins suggest, if we go back to George Nelson's film, is about the origins of design in many ways are to do with weapons. So hence I've used this kind of provocative phrase, the role of the asocial in relation to design. I do hope that what some of the presentation today has done is allow you to kind of begin to think about, maybe begin to understand the way that non-professional designers engage with problems. So that is really the broadening, the diffusion of design thinking beyond what we typically think of as the role of the designer. So again, I think in many ways smugglers are, in inverted commas, designers, but doing something obviously problem solving, material knowledge that acts in a different way than we think about design traditionally. The fourth point is that actually problem solving approaches to design relate in many ways to other forms of problem solving. So that could be illicit or illegal forms of problem solving. So I think some of these points about drug smuggling in particular maybe allow us to think about what problem solving approaches are within design more generally. And then the final point is about the inherent innovation and ingenuity of asocial design. By using the word ingenuity, I'm aware that often if we say something is ingenious, we're very positive about it. Again, I'm not necessarily applauding the types of smuggling that we saw in some of these examples. What I'm interested in, what can we learn from this? What can we learn about materials? What can we learn about systems? What can we learn about networks? And just finally then, a sort of closing statement, hopefully to cover some of the maybe some of the questions you have, but hopefully to give some time for further questions as well. So really at the heart of my research more generally, so the work I've done in the past, but also particularly the new book, is really a desire to tackle head on the relationship between design and the complexity of the social world. So critically for me, what I hope has come across today to a certain extent is that we need to address how design, as a very broad discipline, should consider or must maybe consider its complicity within power relations and forms of domination. So again, I think by doing so, it may offer a perspective from which we can appreciate the radical potential of design in designing fairer, more just and sustainable futures. So I hope to have left you on a bit more of a positive note rather than just thinking, oh, as designers, we are complicit within these forms of domination. But what I do hope is by recognizing this, you can actually think about how can we design for more socially complex problems. Thank you. Thanks very much for listening. I realized I have been talking for about sort of 50 minutes, so apologies for going over. I'm just going to stop sharing now, so hopefully we can have some questions. So thanks very much for everyone's attention.
Thank you so much. So, anyone who has a question, you can open your mic, you can post it on the chat. If you are not comfortable speaking in English, you can write it in Spanish and I'll be glad to translate. So, please let us know or, ask anything.
I think with all the sort of Zoom delivery over the last couple of years, it can sometimes take people a few minutes to type questions. So that's fine. So take as long as you need, and there's no hurry.
You can even comment if you'd like on something that struck you as particularly interesting or different than the things that we've talked about.
It does sound very different than the workshops you've had, but that's where hopefully sort of getting a sense of the different approaches to these points. Okay, so that's from Maria.
Yes.
Yes, so Maria, I think that's so in terms of the shipping pallets. my understanding, by no means am I, sort of a chemist, but from reading the reports in the news press, my understanding was that actually the paint would be taken off, and then the compressed cocaine, there was a particular type of liquid that would then sort of allow it to be separated. So in terms of in its compressed state, I believe it's formed with something else. I don't know the material, but actually when it's sort of essentially kind of mixed with another solvent, it releases the cocaine. But with the paint itself, my understanding was that it was kind of scraped off, if you like. But yeah, I don't have a direct answer to that, I'm afraid. But it's a very good question. I mean, there are, just in further response to that, there are a number of other examples where, and this actually relates to one of the things that I do talk about in the book as well. So thank you for the question, Maria. Is actually the kind of networks of people that are involved, so the networks of actors that are involved in drug smuggling. So, for example, whilst the smugglers might have material knowledge, they have to employ chemists, to work with them in terms of the extracting the cocaine. So it's very much a kind of network of actors, and in many ways, I suppose that reflects how we think about design. Because I think, as designers in sort of traditional senses, we are always working with other people to support what we do, particularly with socially complex issues that we're dealing with. So in many ways, what we see with smuggling is, I think it mirrors this notion of a network of actors who are dealing with certain issues. So then we've got another question. Well, thank you. Okay, well, you said that we need to look. Why not? Yeah, so I think that's a very good point. So interestingly, when I've had discussions with the people who run this Design Against Crime research centre at one of the London universities, I've always been quite, I don't know, not necessarily negative, but quite unsure of this idea of design against crime. But what I've talked to those colleagues about is that they're inherently aware that actually it's not just simply about designing this clip. We need to understand those broader ideas, about the problems themselves. One of the things in particular, and I think this comes down to the kind of politics of this, is that often things like government funding to do with criminality are to do with these very simplistic things about designing a device that stops people stealing, rather than thinking about the broader structural or social or political issues. And this is where I think as designers, and this sort of opens up the discussion a bit, as designers, we do have to be aware of sort of where the funding comes from, the kind of agencies that you're working with in order to tackle some of these points. But I do think, for me, it raises a really important question about thinking more broadly about problems rather than just the singularized problem of stealing bags. So I hope that is sort of maybe something to take away from this as well. And then Valeria, why methods of trafficking? Why did they call my attention? I think in many ways, Valeria, it comes from actually my interest in shipping containers. So I won't bore you too much about that, but is that as a child, where I grew up out just outside of London, and I used to see as a child these shipping containers on the backs of trucks. And I've always been interested in this idea of kind of these networks of distribution. So when I did my PhD, Valeria, that was I investigated logistics. So I was looking at sort of the design of shipping containers and logistical systems. So again, one of the interests I have is in the design of systems. And so there I became interested in trafficking as a form of logistics. So if you think about smugglers trying to traffic something from A to B, in many ways that's what's happening in terms of legal logistics. So if you're thinking about how logistics companies are trying to transport something from China to to Europe or China to Guatemala or wherever, is that actually we have to think about the logistics of moving things. So actually trafficking for me is an interesting parallel to this idea of logistics. So that's really what called it to my attention. But also I think sort of I've always had an interest in the kind of ingenuity that illegality creates. So again, there was something about drug trafficking. I am aware of the moral dimensions of this that really struck me about the ingenuity. Okay. Okay, and thank you again, Maria, for that comment. Yeah, I do think there is a lot about ethics, and I think it's really great to see that ethics is being talked a lot more about within design schools now. But I do think sometimes it's quite good to understand ethics by looking at it from the other side. Um, and a few years ago, and I won't talk too much about this, but there was one of the courses in the School of Design um, on the sort of product design program where one of the projects was to design a device to steal perfume, to go into department stores to design something you could fit around your wrist to then, if you think I don't know your experiences, everyone, but if you have testers of perfume where you can spray them just to, test out the smell, etc. The project was to then ask students to think about how to steal those the liquid within those testing perfumes. So this was very controversial, but I guess what was being argued about there was if we think about ethics from the other side, we can understand it even more. So again, that's just an example of how I think we can look at the kind of importance of ethics in industrial design by thinking about illegality as well. So then there's Laura. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Laura. So as students to be able to have more open mindset and not lock ourselves in with the typical design mentality established by society. Yeah, um, it is something that I think is I've often thought about this because I think it stems from how design is often taught in schools. Again, I don't know in Guatemala whether, and my experience of design was always very much kind of art and design. And I think there was always this kind of presumption that design was the design of material goods, it was the design of the aesthetics of something. So I think in some ways, probably what we need to do is challenge that at a very young age to understand what design is. I think another way to do that, Laura, is actually to think about design in interdisciplinary terms as well. So what we're beginning to see is a growing body of people who are studying design and talking about design, but from other perspectives. So it might be anthropologists talking about design, or it might be even sociologists talking about design as well. So I think in some ways that might unlock the idea of how design has traditionally been thought about by society. So for me, and this is something that I'm very sort of um, very much sort of think about design through as this interdisciplinary lens. So I think for me that's one good way to do it. Okay, that's great, and thank you, Sabine, as well. Yeah. So an interesting point there from Pablo, sort of impressionistic or impressionant, that the humans find creative ways to achieve the goals even when it's illegal. Yeah, that there's something, and again, Pablo, I haven't talked about this today, but there's a very interesting area of study called malevolent creativity. So this is where types of creative practice, which is actually done by criminals, for example. So one of the example, or a few of the examples I talk about in the book are around these discussions on malevolent creativity, and in particular there was a wonderful book called Prisoners' Inventions, and it talks about how prisoners, incarcerated in prisons, were actually creating artifacts for their own use in highly creative ways. So again, there is something, and I agree with you, sort of inherently human in terms of trying to create or trying to be creative. So I think actually what the study of illegality does is actually broaden out what we mean by creativity in many ways. Okay, then Sarah, sorry, yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with you, Sarah. I think that sort of we have often not thought about the negative applications of design. But I do really hope that the book, and by no means am I the only person saying this. There's a really great book as well, if anyone's interested, called Tricky Design, which actually talks about sort of these ideas as well about the kind of negative applications of design. But I do think what's really valuable about sort of hopefully my forthcoming book and the other book, Tricky Design, is that as designers, as students, but it's just everyone in the world, if we can understand these negative histories or negative applications, that we can learn from those and actually make design even more powerful in a socially sustainable way. Okay, Jose, you're very welcome. Shakan, how can we use design to get us to cover the problems more and solve it? Yeah, no, I do think, yeah, I mean, actually, in the talk, I did mention some of the issues I have with sort of problem-solving approaches to design. And probably Carmen remembers this from the program at Edinburgh. I often talk rather than sort of problem solving. I sometimes use different phrases, but I often use the sort of phrase problem exploring issues of design. And so for me, I think rather than necessarily solving the problem, Shakan, I think it's almost sort of exploring what the problem is. So I think as designers, we can, undertake problem solving activities. But one of the issues I think I've had with the phrase problem solving is that it seems to suggest that the problem is there, it's fixed, and the problem never changes. So I think if we have this kind of problem exploring approach, that we understand problems are ongoing. So even if you develop a technical solution to something and you solve it sort of at one stage in the process, it's very likely that further on there's going to be another issue related to that. So I think we need to think about the kind of ongoing nature of problems. So for me, the problem-solving phrase seems to suggest that it's fixed and solved forever, whereas I think in some ways we think about problems as evolving problems. So I'm not saying that designers can't solve problems, but I think we need to see them as ongoing problems rather than necessarily I've fixed that. Okay, I move on to this, move away from this now and onto something else. Some fantastic questions there. So thank you for the questions. It's really got me thinking about some of the ideas I've talked about in the book. Actually, some of the things I probably should have thought about as well. So thank you for the questions.
Thank you so much. I definitely think this was very thought-provoking and very um, a different way to think about design. And it's so important to see it from all aspects. And that systemic part, and especially the effort that goes into developing solutions when you're working in an illegal uh, part, is very, very interesting to see the processes that they're willing to do, and kind of ask ourselves if we are willing to do that kind of effort on our
Yeah.
side.
Yes. Yeah.
Because they're definitely working harder because they have so many things against them.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so there's that strikes me as something that, what is the effort that we're doing? And I love that part about not solving as completely solving, uh, but knowing that is more of a contributing or exploring. I love that word.
Yeah.
Carmen, go ahead. Carmen, did you want to comment?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, some reason I didn't let me turn on my mic. So I was going to say that there's something the idea on edge, so pretty much designing with limited resources. And Curry is going to laugh a little bit here, but it reminds me of an exercise we did actually at the university of how you put yourself in situations that put you on edge. So you kind of explore your creativity further. And I think that's a very interesting exercise to do, like as part of design practices, especially at school, because then you can try to solve problems with limited resources or in very specific circumstances where you usually wouldn't be dealing with. And I think that forces you to be way more creative because the circumstance kind of calls for it. So yeah, I love that part too, because I think that's a way in which we can understand, I don't know, how to design for poverty or how to design for very specific problems that sometimes you don't think enough about them. I don't know. I just love that part.
Thanks, Carmen. Yeah, no, I think I think there are some really interesting kind of educational or kind of pedagogical aspects to this, and I think sort of designing with limited resources, I think, is a really, really interesting point. Designing sort of with a number of constraints in place. So sort of, and for me, that goes to the kind of root of both design, but also creativity. So actually that, and again, I haven't talked about it much today, but the section of the book where it is about this idea of the phrase is ad hocism. So it comes from a book by Charles Jenks called Ad Hocism, where he's looking at the resourcefulness of non-designers. So and how, for example, if the example I always have is if you're trying to hold open a door, probably the easiest thing is to just put something heavy against it, and that is a very resourceful attitude to have, i.e. we don't need to necessarily buy something like a doorstop that sort of fits underneath the door. We can just use a chair. We can use a heavy book, and there's something, I think, sort of what you said there, Carmen, about the kind of the designing with limited resources, but also I think there's something related to what you're doing around these series of events about resourcefulness as well, is that actually if we can repurpose things, we're not necessarily having to buy something that's designed specifically for one purpose, i.e. to hold open a door, we don't need to go to buy something specifically for that purpose. We can repurpose something we have to hand in a much more resourceful way. So as you say, Carmen, I think it is thinking about how we can use some of these approaches to think about designing sort of with particular communities where resources are scarce. The example that I had from the refugee camp in Burkina Faso, that one with the shelter, what was amazing at that refugee camp was the resourcefulness of the migrant community, who basically had literally no money, but they were using the materials they had to hand to build their own, their own shelters, to build their own resources as well. So they didn't ultimately require the materials from the outside sort of charity organizations. It was about the inherent resourcefulness that that community had as well. So I think this notion of resourcefulness is a really important question around sustainability as well, actually.
This ignites all kinds of ideas of things we can do to teach differently as well. So this is wonderful. I know a lot of teachers are here listening, so we will think about this definitely.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, Craig. I don't know if anybody has one last question or comment. We appreciated so much. We knew about this wonderful perspective from Carmen, and we're so thankful to get to know you and to be able to listen. And we're looking forward to your book. We'll see if we can get it for our library.
Well, that would be fantastic. Yeah, I'm sorry it wasn't meant to be so much of a kind of marketing or an advertising for the book, but it was just a chance to talk about some of the ideas in the book.
No, it's wonderful. I think it's a design needs more bibliography actually. There's yes, we cherish every book we can find about it. So
Yeah.
we're definitely excited.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's been great to have the questions and hear everyone's thoughts, and I really appreciate that as well. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the events. They sound amazing. So it's a pity I can't be there to take part in them as well.
I will share. I will send you an email and share the events that will be on our YouTube channel. So maybe you
fantastic.
Can, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thanks, Regina, and thank you everyone else for listening today.
Thank you everyone for joining us today, and I'll see you in the